by the seller and buyer, and the buyer provided with a copy of the lead-based paint brochure prior to the buyer and seller entering into a binding agreement. This agreement must be filled out for all housing built prior to 1978. So notice it says it has to be signed prior to going binding, which means no more contracts can state lead-based paint to be provided by seller 3 days after binding. Because at that point, you've now violated federal law, but you've also put in writing that you intended to violate the federal law. This has to be signed first. That's the entire law, where the buyer has to have the opportunity to inspect the house before they're required to buy it. So it's got to be before they go binding. So when you sit down with your seller and you have your seller engagement agreement signed, you are going to have this exhibit signed at the same time. The seller will fill out their portion. You are then going to put it up on the MLS with your listing. So then when a buyer makes an offer, they can pull this down. So make sure you're doing this all prior. If you forget and you get an offer, you need to have your seller fill out this exhibit, send this back to the buyer, have them complete it, then you can go binding. But this must be done first. You cannot go binding, then sign it. Once you go binding, you're out. So if you sign it after you go binding, if the EPA pulls this, you're getting fined because you have not done it properly. Therefore, it's in violation of the law and you will get a fine. So that's number one. We're going to start doing it prior to going binding. Now let's talk about how we're going to be filling this out now. Last year, the seller checked the box that applied and then initialed at the bottom. This year, they're going to initial the lines that apply. So for the seller's disclosure, they're going to have two initials. They're going to initial under A, either they know about lead-based paint and hazards, or they have no knowledge. So they'll initial 1 or 2. Then B, they're going to initial that they either have reports, they provided them to the buyer, or they have no reports. So they will initial 1 or 2. So seller will have an initial on A, an initial on B for 2 initials. Then for buyer, they're going to have 3 initials. So last year, C and D, it was an or. The buyer checked C or D. This year, because we're matched the EPA language, the or is gone, and the buyer will be initialing C and D. So C says buyer has received copies of all information, if any, listed above. Because they have the words if any, that includes none. So even if the seller has no documents or no copies, buyer still will initial C. Buyer will then initial D, that they have received a pamphlet of protect your family and lead from your home, because that's a part of the law, this exhibit and the pamphlet. So buyer initials C and D. Then on E, buyer is going to initial 2. And 2 states that buyer is waiving the opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards, which shall not prevent buyer from evaluating the property for lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards during any due diligence or right to request repairs period. Now you would say, well, why would they initial 2? I want my buyers to have the opportunity. Well, E1 gives buyers a 10-day opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards prior to buyer being obligated under the purchase and sale agreement. So that means if buyer selects E1, seller has to take their home off the market. The buyer has up to 10 days to inspect for lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. Then if they're satisfied with the results, they can then go binding. I don't know any seller that is going to want to wait for a lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard inspection. Also, for the buyer, if they choose to have this inspection prior to going binding, they can only inspect for lead-based paint. So that means they're going to have multiple inspections because, you know, a lot of inspectors will do lead-based paint and radon and the regular inspection all in one inspection. So they can only do lead-based paint. They can't look at anything else. At this point, they haven't gone binding, so they can't lock in a loan with a lender. So, you know, with our interest rates going up and down so quickly every day, it puts the buyer at a disadvantage as well. But this all boils down to of the actual law itself and why this document has to be done prior to a binding agreement. Because the law states that the buyer must be given an opportunity to inspect the property for lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards prior to being obligated for purchasing the property. That's why if you sign this after going binding, you violated federal law, because the law states it has to all be done prior. Now, the buyer can waive that opportunity and go binding, but they have to do it before they go binding. So they're going to waive their opportunity. However, it does not prevent them from evaluating the property for the lead-based paint during their due diligence or right to request repair. So we're not taking anything away from the buyer. We're just giving them the opportunity during the due diligence where they should have that opportunity anyway, so they've got that time to do that. So buyer will have C, D, and E2. So they will have those three. Then the selling agent, the listing agent, they will initial F. In this state, seller's agent has informed the seller of seller's obligations under 42 USC section 4852D and is aware of his or her responsibility to ensure compliance. Once you initial that, you are stating that you understand the law, that it's your job to make sure everyone's in compliance with the law, which means you will get the fine. So if the EPA comes looking at your broker and you haven't done this properly, it's on you. And unfortunately, there's no fixing this once it's done wrong, because again, the law is very specific. Once you violate the law, you can't go back and say, oh, never mind, change my mind, let's change dates, let's fix it. There's no fixing it. So make sure you're doing this right. It's prior to binding. Seller has 2 initials, buyer has 3 initials, seller's agent has 1 initial. It's signed, it's done, seller, you put it up with the MLS, buyer, you send it with your offer, and you're good to go. In this, the EPA is only looking at houses built prior to 1978. So that's where the fines come into place, the prior to 1978. Does anyone have any questions or concerns about that? Are we
What about a
good?
state?
Okay.
I do, ma'am.
Yes.
What about a state owned?
Yes.
Okay. So if the house was built in 78, this does not apply.
Correct. It's prior to 1978. However, I would still have it just in case. Yeah, because like if the CO was in January of 1978, the house was technically built in 77. So but yeah, it's prior to 1978. So any house built in 77 or earlier.
Well, the lender come back and it said we done it.
Yeah, and so, yeah, if it's something, if it's after 1978 and the lender wants it, or the buyer that's fine, you can fill it out at that point, but the EPA is looking at prior to 1978.
Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions? Remember, this is a safe space. And also, if we've just gone through this and you're like, oh God, I've never filled this out right, it's okay. A lot of the language has changed. So some of them filling it out is a little different, so you're good. Okay. Oh, let me see, look in the